The background of Tymbou Airfield, 1943 to 1945. The British developed the airfield at Tymbou during World War II. Land was rented and purchased from local Greek Cypriot landowners. See accompanying maps. It had 2 paved runways of varying length and additional fair weather strips, but by 1947 the facility was deemed unattractive for development and was mothballed. Tymbou's future lay in limbo. Some people wanted it to be developed as Nicosia's new civilian airport, while others wanted to continue joint military and civilian operations at nearby RAF Nicosia. It appears that ongoing tensions in the Middle East at the time would mean a reprieve for Tymbou. 1950. The British government had debated whether to develop Tymbou since the end of World War II. As one British government official put it, Tymbou is useless as an alternative aerodrome to Nicosia, since it is so close to the latter that the weather conditions at both places are the same. The Cyprus government was funding military and civil operations out of RAF Nicosia at the time and had spent £60,000, equivalent to over 2.5 million in today's money, on upgrading new facilities at the base west of the capital. Tymbou appeared to be a non-starter, with compensation agreements being put in place for the Greek Cypriot landowners and rents also stopping. However, things changed the following year. 1951. The airfield received a reprieve when it was highlighted that air traffic from Cairo, Egypt may need to be diverted to an alternative airport on the island, and that the main runway at RAF Nicosia needed to be repaired urgently. Egypt was a British colony at the time, like Cyprus. Nationalist and independent sentiments had bubbled in various parts of the British Empire after World War II. Plans were implemented to develop Tymbou with temporary structures to accommodate aircraft and passengers. 1952. RAF's purchasing of the land surrounding Tymbou village was recorded. However, some in the British Air Ministry favoured a site at Akrotiri, near Limassol, so much so that surveys were carried out at the site south of the island. A plan to reinstate Larnaca aerodrome had already been abandoned. After the island gained independence from Britain in 1960, an agreement was established between the then Republic of Cyprus government under President Makarios's administration and the British. Documentation seen from the National Archives in London stated that the authorities of the Republic of Cyprus shall take such steps as may be necessary to ensure that the runways, taxiways and dispersal areas at the auxiliary airfield at Tymbou shall remain available for use and be free of permanent obstructions, so that the airfield may be used by any aircraft which it may be necessary to divert from Nicosia airfield in an emergency. Following the end of the Second World War, the RAF held Tymbou and Lakatamia airfields for a while. But in 1952, the United States wanted to make Tymbou Airfield the location for its strategic bomber squadron. However, the British would not allow it. This wasn't the last time the Americans sought a base on the island. RAF Tymbou received a reprieve from permanent closure when the Suez Crisis broke out in Egypt in 1956. It became a base for Britain's Operation Telescope missions and the French Air Force's Operation Musketeer missions. The 5th of November 1956 saw air operations launched from both RAF Nicosia and RAF Tymbou. French and British paratroopers had been practicing in Cyprus, and they would eventually be dropped near the Egyptian port of Port Fouad on the Suez Canal. After the end of the Suez Crisis, the British abandoned RAF Tymbou. In time, the RAF would move all its air operations to Akrotiri, with RAF Nicosia becoming a purely civilian airport and Cyprus's main entry and exit point. Documentation from the time clearly stated that Tymbou would be a reserve airfield maintained by the authorities of the Republic of Cyprus. In 1974, heavy fighting among Turkish, Greek and Cypriot National Guard forces saw the airport at Nicosia designated a United Nations protected area. The UN forces in Cyprus were under strict instructions to protect the airport at all costs, and notified the warring sides that they would do so if there were any advances on taking the island's main airport. The capture of Nicosia Airport was one of the Turkish army's objectives, but this never materialized. In the meantime, they had been using an airfield to the north of the capital, Krini, for logistical operations. However, the landing strip was unsuitable for larger aircraft, and an alternative was sought. On August 15, 1974, the Turkish army moved into the airfield at Tymbou. A day earlier, Turkish forces had moved out of their bridgehead in the center of the island and proceeded both east and west. The former RAF Tymbou airfield was located east of the capital on the old Nicosia to Famagusta main road. As with the airport at Nicosia, fighting for the airfield at Tymbou was intense. However, Turkish forces eventually secured it. At this point, work had begun on repairing the runway. A Turkish Cypriot technical team, accompanied by workers, began preparations to clear and make the main paved runway ready for future flights. The Turkish Air Force was adamant that test flights using military aircraft would have to follow to determine the airfield's suitability. The retired Turkish Air Force Colonel, Şeref Orez, stated, "When we captured the airfield, there had been some hesitation in building an airport in a place so close to the ceasefire line. It was 5 kilometers away from the border. It was feared that the Greeks would fire. If they did, and a plane crashed, we wouldn't have any hesitation in taking over the whole island. We guarded the facility at Tymbou for 2 days. Eventually, we cleared the grass surrounding the runway and opened it. I was on the first plane to land at the airport, and I knew the Greeks were observing our movements. They could see that we were determined, and they didn't attack." Apart from the runways, the airfield was paved and unpaved. The British had removed all buildings from the site. There were no navigational aids, and one of the first Turkish Air Force pilots attempting to land at the airfield reported that he had to use coordinates on a map to locate the landing strip. One of the first test flights into Tymbou occurred thanks to a smoke trail near the site and military personnel on the ground. The pilot of the C-47 Dakota aircraft touched down on the runway, which hadn't been maintained since the mid-1950s. He suffered a few nervous moments as his plane sprayed up dirt, rock, asphalt and pebbles before the aircraft eventually stopped. The pilot then inspected his aircraft to to see if there had been any damage. Apart from a few dents to the fuselage caused by pebbles hitting the plane on landing, all was good. He had been more concerned about the aircraft's wheels sinking in the untreated tarmac in the middle of summer. The airfield then became operational for military flights to take home sick, wounded, and deceased soldiers. Even though Tymbou had been secured, there were fears that nearby Greek forces could still attack the airfield. Tymbou was not far from the green line separating both sides. There was genuine concern that although it was a better alternative to Krini, Tymbou was literally in the firing line and planes could be shot at. Once the fighting had ceased, an uneasy truce arose. In time, the airfield was cleared for future development. The Turkish military used it to fly logistical operations into the island. It would eventually be known as Ercan Airport, named after a Turkish Air Force officer, Fehmi Ercan, who had been killed near the beach at Pentimili, near Kyrenia, on the northern coast of Cyprus. When the hostilities stopped in the summer of 1974, Cyprus had no functioning airport to speak of. The main airstrip at Nicosia, formerly RAF Nicosia, was now in the hands of the United Nations. It had suffered bomb damage, and the taxiways and runways of the airfield were littered with the remains of aircraft belonging to Cyprus Airways. In the following months, it was hoped that the two leaders of the Cypriot communities would agree on reopening the airport in Nicosia. However, discussions were also held about using RAF Akrotiri in the south of the island as a humanitarian gateway for both Turkish and Greek Cypriots. The British, who controlled the airbase at Akrotiri, also held discussions with the relevant authorities about utilizing the facility at Akrotiri, but nothing came to fruition. In the meantime, the Turkish Cypriots proceeded with the development of the airfield at Tymbou, now renamed Ercan Airport, while the Greek Cypriots focused on expanding the old British base in Larnaca to provide air services from the island. The race was on to see who could finish their airports first. It was hoped that the airfields at Ercan and Larnaca would be a temporary measure. In time, the main airport at Nicosia would reopen, allowing both communities to access the island's primary transportation hub. However, things were never that straightforward. By February 1975, both airports at Ercan and Larnaca were nearing completion. The Turkish Cypriots constructed a prefabricated terminal building at the site, but initially there were no navigation aids or runway lighting, and flights were restricted to daytime visual flight conditions only. The only passenger jet capable of landing at that time was the Fokker F-28, an aircraft specifically designed for rough and short runways. Turkish Airlines began operating with these jets into and out of Ercan to destinations in Turkey, initially including Istanbul, Ankara, and Adana. On the 3rd of February 1975, the first flight landed, and a week later, planes began flying into Larnaca. The following film illustrates how Ercan operated during that time. A little later, in 1975, flights started taking off and landing at Ercan. The then government of the Republic of Cyprus reported the issue to the UN, pointing out that under Cypriot legislation, Ercan Airport was not an approved aerodrome, nor was it a designated customs airport by the Convention on International Civil Aviation. Consequently, all flights operating between Turkey and Ercan Airport were illegal and ran contrary to the principles and objectives of the International Civil Aviation Organization. At the time, threats were made to any international carriers wishing to land in an area designated as the Turkish Federated State of Cyprus. It was feared that the Turkish Cypriots would eventually secede from the Republic of Cyprus, something the Greeks would never tolerate. Contemporary documentation clearly stated that the government of the Republic of Cyprus, which was the only internationally recognized authority on the island, requested that all countries should take all necessary measures and refrain from operating any air services, whether scheduled or non-scheduled, to the so-called Ercan Airport in the north. Therefore, due to politics, laws, regulations, red tape and bureaucracy, Ercan's prospects seemed extremely limited. In addition, the Republic of Cyprus government had demanded that countries and aviation organizations have no dealings whatsoever with the illegal so-called carrier Cyprus Turkish Airlines. Cyprus Turkish Airlines was formed in December 1974 in partnership with Turkish Airlines. The fledgling carrier leased planes from Turkish Airlines and operated to destinations within Turkey, using a Turkish registration on their aircraft to bypass flight controls. The Turks, however, were not perturbed, and they pushed and probed political and aviation laws regarding the use of Ercan Airport. The airport, formerly known as RAF Tymbou, was being closely watched and monitored by outside agencies. By 1977, the prefabricated temporary buildings at Ercan had disappeared, and a new concrete passenger terminal had risen. It was designed to look like the old terminal building at the now defunct Nicosia International Airport, which had been closed since July 1974. A new control tower and a larger apron were also added for bigger jets to access. Planes could also now land at night time due to the installation of runway lights, which had taken place a year earlier. The main runway, 11/29 had also been extended. The Turkish Cypriot administration upgraded facilities at the airport, including cargo, catering and fire service buildings. A return to Nicosia International for both communities seemed a long way off, with peace talks stalling. On the other side of the island at Larnaca, the Greek Cypriots were also improving their facilities as both sides tried to recover from the events of 1974. The debate about the legality of Ercan and flights into the northern part of Cyprus continues today. However, planes chartered from other countries by the Turkish Cypriots were again threatened by the Republic of Cyprus during this period. Laws linked to the Chicago Aviation Convention of 1944 were cited, discouraging foreign carriers from landing at Ercan. In 1977, aircraft belonging to a West German airline and later an African carrier were subject to fines and banning orders if they attempted to land in the north. On occasion, foreign aircraft did get through, much to the indignation of the Greek Cypriots. This included flying livestock from Ercan to places such as Saudi Arabia. An American charter company made it to Ercan in the late 1970s, when it was leased by the Turkish Cypriot Airlines. For a brief period, Aero America, based out of Seattle, USA, and Berlin, Germany, carried passengers from the north to airports in Turkey, using an American flight crew and a mixture of US and Turkish Cypriot stewardesses. There was a lot of bewilderment about the whole operation, and no doubt complaints surfaced from the south of the island about the contract between Aero America and the Turkish Cypriots. Recently, planes registered from Azerbaijan and the UK have also landed at Ercan, with a flight from the Azeri capital Baku being one of the few non-stop aviation journeys made to the north, and this occurred in 2005. Furthermore, in 1977, the Turkish Cypriot administration introduced their own so-called Ercan Advisory Airspace, encouraging airlines flying over the territory under their control to communicate with them directly instead of with the Republic of Cyprus's Nicosia Flight Information Region. This has led to safety concerns for planes flying into and out of Cyprus or over the island. Turkish and Greek Cypriot aviation bodies will not communicate with each other over this issue, even though specific directives from the International Air Transport Association have made it clear what must be followed when flying to Cyprus or over its airspace. Even today, the Republic of Cyprus continues to log and register all flights going into and out of Ercan, or flying in the island's northern part. On occasion, some flights originating from Turkish airports are known to have entered the buffer zone on their approach into Ercan, as the airport is so close to the Green Line. Miscalculations by unfamiliar airport pilots have been blamed, but no serious incidents have been reported. By the end of 1983, the Turkish Federated State of Cyprus had given way to the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. The move was condemned internationally, and the breakaway state is currently only recognized by Turkey. The move would further impact Ercan's role in the forthcoming years, as well as travel into the TRNC. Non-stop flights into Ercan are not permitted unless they have originated from the Turkish mainland, and even this is deemed illegal by the Republic of Cyprus government. The decision to reverse this can only be made by the authorities in the south of the island in conjunction with the IATA, Chicago Convention Guidelines, and the United Nations. The continuing political impasse between both communities means negotiations about the island's future have stalled. The Greek Cypriots feel that any upgrade in Ercan status as a recognised airport will mean recognition of the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. Discussions about this issue continue, with lawyers and politicians debating Ercan's role and flights into the north. In the meantime, the old terminal building received a facelift in 2002 and reopened in 2004. However, plans were made to upgrade all facilities at the airport. A private company took over the management of Ercan Airport in 2012, determined to improve the north's primary entry point. The old terminal could accommodate only a limited number of passengers. Although the airport has been described as quirky and compact, significant adjustments were needed to align it with international standards. On one occasion, it was referred to as a Mickey Mouse airport by a pilot trying to humour his onboard passengers after their flight was delayed on the ground at Ercan. However, the pilot's joke irked a Turkish journalist on board the plane, who reported the incident and wrote a news article about the pilot's conduct. The private company running Ercan constructed a new terminal and runway with additional facilities opposite the old 1977 passenger building. Due to COVID and other issues, it was delayed and finally opened in July 2023. Air bridges have now replaced air stairs onto the planes, and the last flight from the old terminal took place on Thursday, 20th of July 2023. However, the transition to the new terminal has not gone smoothly. There has been the usual mudslinging between different factions linked to the airport following any significant construction project. Some have questioned the rush to open the terminal, which was still considered a building site. Unions linked to the North's Electricity Authority and Air Traffic Control Association have clashed with officials from the North's government and the airport operator. In October 2023, one retired pilot pointed out issues with the new 3,000-foot runway. As he put it, there were no centre line lights. Ercan frequently has CA2 fog conditions, and you need them to land. Otherwise, you must divert. Hopefully, the issue has been addressed. There has also been infighting, with the local media reporting alleged corruption and cover-ups. After all, this is the way of the world today, and accountability, responsibility, and ownership of problems are rarely questioned or addressed. Cyprus is a small island, remember. All alleged accusations in this video are readily available online for further scrutiny. When the multi-million-pound new terminal finally opened, a Turkish Cypriot government spokesman stated, "This investment is an enviable masterpiece to be envied. As you know, direct flight restrictions have been imposed on the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus unfairly and inhumanely for years. The TRNC has gained a respectable place in civil aviation thanks to this investment. I am sure that our citizens, tourists from abroad and our neighbours, the Greek Cypriots, will enjoy travelling from the new airport. Our ultimate goal is to open Ercan Airport, the only airport Turkish Cypriots open to the world to international flights." Alleged sacrilege was almost achieved when rumours abounded that the airport would be renamed. However, Fehmi Ercan's family, living in Turkey, condemned the supposed move and lobbied the administration in the north, which eventually backed down. What of the old terminal building? It has been reported that it will eventually become a cargo hub or a casino. It's not as if the north doesn't have enough casinos already. Maybe a more sensible idea would be to construct a hotel on the site, as with other airports around the globe. Watch this space. Controversies continue, and Ercan is not alone in facing problems. In March 2025, we saw power outages at major hubs like Heathrow and delays in constructing Berlin's new Brandenburg Airport, which journalists describe as a story of failure and embarrassment. Only time will tell if Ercan has a long-term future or if it becomes the proverbial white elephant. This is a story of Tymbou to Ercan, a Cyprus aviation story.